On August 14, 1944, the morning began like any other on a remote airstrip in New Guinea. But within hours, this day would enter the unofficial history of one squadron and become a story veterans would recount for decades. And it all started with a single airplane, a Curtiss Kittyhawk Mk IV, with a shark mouth on the nose and an odd, almost joking name painted beneath the canopy, Svangali. At first glance, it was just another fighter, one of hundreds that toiled across the Pacific, pushing themselves to the edge in the tropical heat and mud. But among the pilots of the 75th Squadron, Svangali was different. They said the aircraft had a personality, almost a will of its own. And this morning, it would prove exactly what that meant. Australian ground crews rolled fighters out to the strip. The fog still clung to the runway after a night of rain. The air was thick, so heavy it felt like it could be cut. Through the low clouds came the distant rumble of waves breaking on the shore. Pilots prepared for yet another strike against Japanese positions around Wewak, a heavily fortified hub that threatened the entire Allied advance. Among the pilots was a man known for his calm, steady presence. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, and he wasn't interested in glory. What he did have, though, was a reputation. He always came back, no matter what the mission threw at him. Svangali had been his aircraft for months now, and the connection between man and machine had become something more than routine familiarity. He knew every vibration in the airframe, every 5 degrees of trim change, every sound the engine made at different power settings. That kind of connection mattered in this war. Sometimes it meant the difference between life and death. While the mechanics checked oil pressure and cylinder temperatures, the pilot ran through his checklist. Everything looked normal. Yet something in the air felt tense, unspoken but understood. As Allied forces pushed deeper, Japanese resistance grew more desperate. Their anti-aircraft crews were getting deadly accurate. Their camouflage was improving. Their ambushes were more coordinated. And on this day, the Japanese were preparing a trap that nearly cost the pilot his life. When the engine fired up, the morning trembled. The Kittyhawk exhaled a cloud of smoke and began taxiing to the runway. The wheels bounced on the uneven strip, but the aircraft accelerated confidently. Seconds later, it lifted into the air, climbing into the heavy tropical sky. The route to the target wasn't long, but flying over jungle was always dangerous. Beneath the green canopy, Japanese spotters and gunners hid in impossible places. They knew the Allied flight paths. They knew the timing. They knew how to lure aircraft into kill zones. The pilot kept Svangali extremely low, sometimes brushing the tops of trees. This wasn't bravado, it was survival. Radar struggled to track aircraft flying that low, and anti-aircraft crews only had seconds to react. But flying that low was its own threat. One mistake, one downdraft, one unseen ridge, and the jungle would swallow both plane and pilot. Minutes later, he spotted the first landmark, a sharp bend in the river that looked like it had been drawn with a compass. That meant the target was close. He gave a short message over the radio. His voice was calm, so calm that others later said they couldn't tell anything was wrong even when disaster struck. The squadron approached the Japanese supply area using a standard attack plan: steep dive, drop ordnance, sharp break to the right, and escape at treetop level. It had worked many times before. But not today. The Japanese hadn't positioned their anti-aircraft guns around the supply depot. Instead, they placed them directly along the predicted escape route, exactly where the Kittyhawks would be just seconds after releasing their bombs. When Svangali pulled out of the dive and banked right, the world erupted. The first shells missed. The second tore through the tail section. The third smashed straight into the oil radiator. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning oil. The pressure gauge plummeted so fast the needle looked broken. The engine temperature spiked. The aircraft shuddered violently, as if something massive had grabbed the fuselage and was trying to tear it apart. The tail vibrated so hard the pilot feared it would shear clean off. Most pilots would have bailed out at this point, But parachuting into these jungles was nearly a death sentence. The canopy was too thick, the terrain too uneven, and Japanese patrols were relentless. Survival chances were slim. So, the pilot made his choice instantly. He would try to get home. He transmitted a brief message. Hit, losing pressure, returning. From that moment, the next 12 minutes became some of the most intense in the squadron's history. Svangali was barely controllable. The tail section was shaking violently. The controls were heavy and unpredictable. Every movement of the stick required immense strength. The engine sputtered and coughed. A trail of black smoke streamed behind the aircraft. The pilots flying behind him watched in disbelief. They could see the oil pouring out. They could see the tail twisting slightly with every gust. They knew the aircraft could fail at any second, break apart, stall out, or burst into flames. But he kept flying. He chose a route over the river, knowing that if the engine failed completely, he might at least attempt a water ditching. The risk was enormous, but less than crashing into the jungle. When he finally reached the coastline, he heard voices on the radio. The entire squadron was tracking him, talking him through the last stretch, but he barely responded. Every bit of focus he had was on keeping Svangali in the air. When the runway finally appeared ahead, the aircraft was seconds from total failure. The engine temperature was off the scale. The oil pressure gauge read 0. The vibrations were so intense that the pilot later said he thought the fuselage was flexing. At 50 feet above the ground, the engine gave one final surge of power, almost as if the aircraft understood what was at stake. He used it to level out. The Kittyhawk hit the runway hard, bounced, hit again, and bounced once more. But it stayed upright. It rolled forward another 100 meters and came to a stop. Silence. Then slowly, the pilot opened the canopy and climbed out. Ground crews ran toward the aircraft and froze. The tail was shredded. The oil radiator was completely blown apart. The engine had essentially destroyed itself. By all logic, the aircraft should have fallen from the sky. But it hadn't. Svangali brought him home. The aircraft was repaired, barely, and returned to service. And that alone would have been enough to make it memorable. But weeks later, something happened that sealed Svangali's place in squadron folklore. It was supposed to be a routine engine run-up, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. But as a mechanic leaned into the cockpit, he accidentally nudged the throttle. The wheel chocks slipped, and before anyone understood what was happening, Svangali lurched forward. It shot down the runway, it gained speed, and then, impossibly, it took off. A completely empty fighter aircraft climbed into the air, engine roaring. Mechanics and pilots could only watch, stunned, as Svangali flew away, uncontrolled, unpiloted, a ghost in the sky. It held altitude for several minutes, drifting out over the forest. Then, gradually, it began to descend. Minutes later, it crashed into the jungle. No one was hurt, but the story spread instantly. One pilot said if he could have come back, he would have, but he'd already done his job. The legend of Svangali grew not because it was the best aircraft or the most powerful or the most decorated. It grew because this single fighter seemed to show something that felt almost human: determination in the face of destruction, loyalty to the man whose life it saved, and a strange final flight that no one could quite explain. Today, only dedicated aviation historians know the name Svangali, but in 1944, to the men of the 75th Squadron, it meant something special. It was a reminder that sometimes war isn't defined by grand battles or famous aces. Sometimes it's just one pilot, one damaged machine, and one impossible flight home. And perhaps that's why this story endures, because in the worst conditions imaginable, both man and machine proved stronger than the moment trying to destroy them.